Short story by Paul McCann. I forgot to come home. Morning came, and sunlight streamed through the windows of the dementia unit at Falling Leaves Nursing Home. Simon had been awake for hours and sat in a chair by the door as staff came to start their morning shift. It was almost like Simon had become invisible. He sat there. Nobody bothered to look or speak to him. The normal routine of showering had begun. Residents were getting dressed, and some getting ready for their breakfast. Simon noticed that the front door of the dementia unit had been left open. And so, one of the night staff apparently had not closed it properly. And nobody saw Simon slipping out and making his way over to the front reception area. At that very moment, an early morning visitor, Reverend John Olbrey, had come to see one of the residents. And there he met Simon at the front door. Simon smiled, and the Reverend said, "Good morning. Have you been visiting someone?" Simon coughed. "Have you seen my mother?" "What's her name?" replied the minister, before thinking that maybe he would know her. Simon stood there, staring blankly. The minister put his arms around Simon and sympathetically said, "Oh yes, I know these places can sure be a challenge. I hope your mother gets better soon. Have a nice day then." In a rush, the minister had left Simon there and wandered off, and Simon walked out the front door that had been left open by the Reverend. The taxi that had just dropped off the minister was about to leave. Simon innocently gave a wave to the driver. The driver of the taxi stopped and got out and opened the passenger door, thinking he had a fare. So Simon got into the taxi, and when the driver asked where he wanted to go, he said, "To my mother's house." "Okay, what's the address?" The taxi driver smiled and said. Simon, amazingly, rattled off the address of his mother's house. 22 New Brighton Road, Purley. "Okay, that's about an hour from here." The driver was on his way along Billerkey Road towards London. He stopped at a petrol station on the way. "Do you want anything in the shop? I've just got to get some cigarettes. Is there anything you need?" Simon never answered. The driver got out of the taxi and walked towards the shop. And at that moment, Simon got out of the taxi and wandered away. He followed some people who were headed along the road to the local market. Simon started to wander amongst the stalls and the people. We're back at the petrol station. The taxi driver returned to find his passenger had disappeared. He asked everyone who was around if they had seen the man leaving his taxi, but no one did. The driver wasn't happy. Cursing and swearing, he threw his arms up in the air before getting back into the car and driving off at speed on the road towards London. Back at the markets, Simon was wandering around in a world of his own, looking at the different stalls and talking to his imaginary friend. People were too busy looking for bargains to take any notice of Simon and his strange behaviour. In fact, he almost blended in with some of the shoppers. No one saw him at the fruit stall picking up an apple and eating it. Simon followed a crowd of tourists who were making their way back to a bus that was parked at the marketplace. He got on board the bus with the others and he took a seat at the back, looking out the window. The bus headed off towards London. Nobody even noticed him there in the back seat. They assumed he was one of the tourists in their group. Meanwhile, back at Falling Leaves nursing home, the staff had become aware of their missing resident, and the frantic search had begun for Simon's whereabouts. They checked every room, and then they looked at the footage on the closed-circuit cameras. To their shock, they discovered that earlier in the morning Simon had managed to leave the dementia unit and even walk out of the building and getting into a taxi. Immediately, the director of nursing informed the police and Simon's family about the situation. And now a search was in progress for Simon. Back on board the tourist bus, there was a sing-along happening with Simon even joining in, and some of the songs, he remembered the words. After a while, the bus made another scheduled stop. Everyone got off the bus and Simon followed behind with the rest of the tourists. They made their way into an art gallery. Simon wandered off on his own inside the gallery, picking up some flowers on the ground and talking to the little children and the little dog that no one else could see but him. After a while, Simon left the art gallery and wandered off along the pavement. He stood there with a crowd of people at a bus stop who were waiting for a bus. Soon a double-decker bus arrived and Simon got on board with the others in the queue, and he took a seat near the back door of the bus. The bus conductor approached Simon and he said, "What start you getting on, Gov?" Simon sat there on the seat, looking into space. "What station you going to, Gov?" An old lady opposite called out and tried to attract Simon's attention. "Where are you going, young man?" she asked. Simon replied, "Do you know my mother?" The old woman replied, "What was your mother's name and where does she come from?" Simon immediately replied, "Mavis Davis. She lives in 22 New Brighton Road, Purley." The conductor laughed, and he rolled off a bus ticket and he handed it over to Simon, and he stood there waiting for a payment. Simon took the ticket off the conductor and sat and smiled. The old lady opposite him said, "Oh, here, let me help." She kindly opened her purse and gave the conductor the money for the fare. She looked at the conductor and she smiled and said, "I think this young man is lost. Isn't it a coincidence because I used to live on New Brighton Road many years ago? Maybe this young man knows me somehow." Suddenly Simon stood up unexpectedly, walked to the back door. Then he stepped off the bus while it was in motion, falling to the ground, where bystanders rushed to assist. As he lay there unconscious, an ambulance was called. It wasn't too long before the sirens screamed and flashing lights were seen coming through the afternoon traffic. All the traffic moved to one side, allowing the ambulance right of way. A small crowd of people stood around Simon when the ambulance came. Two paramedics emerged from the ambulance and rushed to assess the situation. One of them asked, "Anyone see what happened?" The old lady who had been on the bus spoke up. "I sat on the bus near him. He mentioned he was going to see his mother just before he stood up and fell off the bus." The paramedic asked, "Did he say where his mother lived?" She smiled, saying, "He seems to think I knew his mother. She's something about Mavis Davis, I think her name was. She lived at 22 New Brighton Road, Purley." The medic thanked the old lady and then went to examine the casualty, who was unconscious on the ground. There was no response. The paramedic started CPR and continued until the casualty started coughing. Then he was placed into the ambulance on a stretcher, and the crowd watched the ambulance drive off at speed. The old lady waved at the ambulance and said, "I hope you find your mother." A short while later, in the emergency section of Guy's Hospital, Simon awoke and he tried to sit up in his bed. And one of the nurses saw, and she came over and she said, hello there, do you remember what happened? Simon just stared into space. My mother will be worried about me. I never came home. The nurse looked at his observations and noticed the news that had just come on the television. And there was a story about a missing resident from Falling Leaves nursing home. Then they showed a picture of the missing resident. Oh, that's you, she laughed. It's you. Immediately she called the supervisor. And when it was discovered who the patient in the hospital really was, everyone laughed and sighed, and at last Simon had been found. They notified the nursing home where Simon was. And while they were waiting, they did some further tests, which took about 3 or 4 days, before they discharged Simon back to the Falling Leaves nursing home. On the first night back in the nursing home, Simon had packed some clothes into a bag and went to the exit door of the dementia unit. Are you going somewhere, Simon? Said the night nurse. My mother will be worried where I am, Simon replied. It's okay, she knows. We already told her where you are, so don't worry, said the nurse. Are you sure she knows where I am? Simon said. And the nurse replied, Yes, she will pick you up tomorrow morning, so you better go and have some sleep, or you'll be tired in the morning. That night, Simon was assisted by some medication to help him sleep. And when morning arrived, some of the residents had already got up and were sitting around pushing prams and walking little children with their school bags. Simon said good morning to all the little children. Medication time came and breakfast was over, and the morning staff were busy in their duties. Outside the sun was shining in a blue sky, and the birds chirped, and the chorus of life was beginning again for another day. Later in the day, some of Simon's family members came to visit. One of them was 83-year-old Mavis Davis, Simon's mother. Simon's mother was brought in on a wheelchair from the nursing home where she lived. She was seated next to Simon just before lunch at a table, but he never even recognized who she was. After about an hour, the visitors left, and Mavis kissed goodbye to her son, who didn't know who she was. And the everyday activities continued at Falling Leaves nursing home with some stories and karaoke session. Simon still talked to the little children who visited him during the day, and to the dog who liked to visit him every now and then. The end.